I had a little bit of free time, and I started a side project, a hobby project called the Third Wave. And this was in late 2015. It was just when microdosing was starting to gain some popularity, and by that point in time, it was clear that cannabis was becoming medicalized and legalized. It was clear that a lot of the research coming out of institutions like NYU and Johns Hopkins was clear that psychedelics were effective at treating depression and PTSD. So in creating the Third Wave as a resource, I wanted to start to build a cultural infrastructure for how, we can actually learn scientific facts about psychedelics, and really how can we start to educate our culture about what are the benefits and some of the risks of psychedelics in a rational, formalized way. And so I built the Third Wave. And since that point in time, it's just been really starting to grow in popularity. We were in the New York Times and Rolling Stone. And the message of responsible psychedelic use for intentional purposes, whether that's creativity or healing or leadership, a lot of people seem to be resonating with that message now.
Yeah. Thank you for that background. And you touched on several things that relate to my question about your vision. One thing you spoke about courage, and clearly you have a lot of courage. You've been standing up and speaking out all over the place, and being very open. It's like I just, by virtue of listening to your podcast, I know all kinds of stuff about you that in years past would have been secrets, but you're just out there, really out there in a big way. And you also referred to the culture and feeling like the culture was out of step for you. And clearly you are into redesigning culture in a way. I believe you've said starting at the bottom.
Yes.
And so you can get into that. And the other key word that I've really been thinking a lot about since discovering your work is intentionality. And that makes it a very different enterprise than when I was coming up in the second wave. Mm-hmm. So tell us about the three waves, what the three waves are that you're referring to, and then let's get into your vision. You can spell it out.
That would be great. So the first wave of psychedelic use was, the use of psychedelics by indigenous groups for thousands of years. So this is, the beverage kykeon, which was used in ancient Greece in something called the Eleusinian Mysteries, which Plato and Aristotle were a part of. And that's really the core of Western philosophy when it comes to psychedelics. And then you had ayahuasca in the Amazon. You had Soma in ancient India, which was written about in the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. And there are various other, indigenous societies and groups around the world who have been using these plant medicines for thousands of years to access visionary states. And so, unfortunately, though, around the time where Christianity became more the mainstream perspective in Western thought, a lot of those visionary plants were kind of put away. And that was until the 50s and 60s, when this is the second wave now, when Gordon Wasson, who was a vice president of JP Morgan and an amateur mycologist, went down to Oaxaca and discovered the magic mushroom, and then wrote about it in Life magazine. It was the front page in 1957. And that's when these visionary substances, psychedelics, started to re-enter and re-emerge in Western consciousness. And that led to Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert. That led to really the kind of crescendo that occurred during the 60s, where LSD was legal and a lot of people were consuming it. But what happened was it got a little out of control. There wasn't the really infrastructure in place to support a lot of the awakening that was happening culturally. Yeah. And so the administration at the time tied psychedelic use to the anti-war movement and shut down all the research that was going on, because there was tons of research in the 50s and 60s. They shut down and made all the substances illegal and inaccessible. And this was very non-normative. In other words, there have always been a place for these substances within Western culture, as I mentioned, the Eleusinian Mysteries with ancient Greece. And so when everything was shut down, the prohibition of psychedelics, it was really this new time period where we couldn't explore these states in a responsible way. And so what happened, with the third wave is in 1999, Bob Jesse reached out to a researcher at Johns Hopkins named Roland Griffiths, and connected him to Bill Richards, who was one of the early researchers in the 60s with psilocybin. And in 2006, they published a landmark paper about the role of psilocybin in occasioning mystical type experiences. And for me, this marks the beginning of the third wave, when that first research paper was established. And since that point in time, so about 12 years now, there's been a continuous growth of interest in psychedelics for medical purposes specifically. But outside of that, we've also seen, obviously, the medicalization and legalization of cannabis. So these substances that were previously deemed illicit and had no medical value by institutions like the US government were now coming into our consciousness as, oh, these might have legitimacy. And so where this is going, where this appears to be going, and this is more or less the vision, is as even modalities like yoga and mindfulness meditation become more mainstream, psychedelics are also a part of that. In other words, it allows us as individuals to step out of, okay, I need to be focused on doing this in the future, or I'm worried about this in the past, and be more present.